All right, so we're going to start. So first of all, welcome to the 65th anniversary of the ORC. I hope they had a good Thanksgiving break. How are you? So the idea here is, well, first of all, thank you for coming, and for those of you that will provide and give a talk, and thank you. The idea is that we're going to give a little update on the ORC for about 10-15 minutes before we start. Okay, so thank you again. And in terms of the logistics, I think it's pretty clear. If you have any questions, you can ask Laura or Andrew. And thank you for both of them, actually, for doing everything again. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Andrew. All right, so let's start. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on the state of the ORC. So I have like a few slides, not a lot, with some numbers, because we like numbers. So essentially, here is a summary a little bit about where we are now. So in terms of the number of faculty that are affiliated with the center, we have about 54 of them. In terms of number of graduate students, we have 87. 73 of them are PhDs and 14 are masters. I would say that this is part of the regular program. That means that what we had as a PhD program and a master program. So we have, again, two main degrees. That's not a surprise to most of you, PhD and SM. Students are admitted directly to the ORC, and we give our own degree, which is the only interdepartmental program at MIT that does that. In 2015, we changed a little bit the reporting structure within MIT, and now we report to both deans of Sloan and the School of Engineering dean. Before that, we were reporting to the VP for Research. And it's not a big deal, except that now we have more emphasis of education, and we have support for both deans, and that's very important, and you will see why. In terms of the split, in terms of faculty, you'll see here 55% are coming from Sloan, 35 from engineering, and I listed here the main departments that are affiliated with the School of Engineering, and then the rest is coming from other departments and schools. So as some of you have seen, or if you have not seen, you can go and see, we have moved in January 2016 to a new physical space. We have a new website in 2016. It might be time to renew it again, every 2 years, essentially. And then Dimitri will talk a little bit more about the Master of Business Analytics that we started also in the fall of 2016 in collaboration with Sloan. So that's essentially the status of where we are. I wanted to give also a little bit of background in terms of new faculty. The ORC is a very dynamic place. And in the past 5 years, these are the list of faculty that have been hired in various units within MIT and that have been invited to be part of the ORC. So we have quite a bit of faculty from Sloan, either from the Operation Research Group or the Operation Management Group, or in some cases the Marketing Group. And we also have quite a bit of faculty from EECS, especially those that are interested in machine learning and data and optimization. Now, you might ask, what is the order in which these faculty have been listed? There is an order to that madness, and you have to figure out by the end of the talk. And okay, so I'm going to move now to the admissions process. So again, here I listed since 2013. Why? Because I didn't have all the data from before, but also there was a significant shift in 2013 compared to previous years in terms of the pool of applicants that we had, in terms of number of students. So there was a shift of about between 50 and 100 new applicants every year. And since then, it has been pretty stable, and it's linked to essentially the interest in, again, analytics, big data, machine learning, and applied statistics. So here are the selectivity is essentially between 7 and 9% all the time. During that time, it's pretty stable. And the yield has been between 55 and 86%. And I listed here exactly what the numbers are. So we are in a good state on that matter. In terms, I gave also a little bit about the proportion of female applicants. And here the way you want to read it is that this is the percentage of female among total in pool for the first number. the percentage of female that has been among the total offers, and the percentage of female that have among the total acceptances. I just wanted to track these. And in terms of the percentage to the pool, if you look at these numbers here, it's pretty stable. It's about 30% of the pool are coming from female applicants. In terms, this is the offer that we make. So 29% of those accepted are female, and so on and so forth, and these are the ones accepted. And we wanted to see, and it's pretty stable. The past years, we have an increase. So essentially, the female applicants tend to like the ORC more than the other ones, but that's what it is. So in terms of US citizen, this is, I don't have all the numbers there, okay, here. This is the percentage of US citizen. Now, why do we record that? Well, because we've been asked to record that. So I wanted to give you that notion as well. Doesn't really matter. There are many people that do study undergraduate in the US that are not US citizen. And of course, we have a lot of applicants worldwide. In terms of placements, I didn't update this data, but essentially it's very stable. Typically, we get about 55% of our PhD students that go to academia, 45% to industry. And during that period of 6 years, we had 70 of our PhD students on the market and 55 SM students. And here I'm going to give very briefly, without putting name and embarrassing some of you that are in the audience, where these placements have been put in each year in the academia. So here, so you get a sense of the range of our graduates. They essentially populate most of the top programs in the US, and in some cases with many more than just one in each. And in terms of industry placement, it goes all over the place, from very, very small boutique to very large organization to startups. It gives you an idea here of the last one that I put here is startups. We have quite a bit of PhD students that are starting their own business, starting out of the program. And that's all what I wanted to say for this introduction, just to give you an idea of where we are. The bottom line associated with all of that is that we are in a great place, right? And so that's the message that we have. We continue to attract some of the best students worldwide, and we continue to place them in the top places. So that said, unless there are specific questions on the numbers I gave you, we can discuss that later. Then I will ask Dimitri to come and talk to the next new things that we have done, which is the Master of Business Analytics. Dimitri?
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome again. So I'll be talking about a significant new activity, the Master of Business Analytics. And to place it into context, I would like to define what analytics means according to us. It's not necessarily the same for everybody else, but well, I wanted to define, but apparently something happened to the slides. But so before I start with the data, the way we define analytics is as follows. We start, OR historically has been more associated from models to decisions. Data historically, even though it was very present in the Morse era, later in its history has declined. At the same time, the emergence of machine learning introduced from data to models to predictions, less on decisions, and our definition of analytics is a union of the two, from data to models to decisions, sometimes through predictions. And this is reflected in this program. So we launched it in 2015. The first class, it's a 12-month program from September to August. So this is the growth. The first year, we had 302 applicants, 16 people came and 16 graduated. Second year, 825, we had 30 coming and 30 graduating. This year we had 44, and our target for the year after is 60 We shall see what happens after that, assuming the growth of applications increases. Therefore, the selectivity gives us opportunities to grow further. There is a possibility of perhaps growing. We shall see about that. But we have been happy about the steady increase of the program. In terms of so people talk about data science and so forth. Analytics, in my view, is different. It includes the whole process from data to decisions, and this is reflecting in the curriculum. So we have a class called the Analytics Edge that some of you participate in designing, applied probability and stochastic models, optimization methods, machine learning, analytics, from analytics to action, and then software tools and communicating with data. These are the core courses, and then there are a huge number of electives. As you know, MIT has many, many courses. We maintain the same requirement about like the ORC Center has, 4.5 out of 5, which is the highest in the institute. And, but still, all of our students have maintained it. A key characteristic of this program is that it's closer to doctoral education than it is to MBA education. In other words, in many business school programs around the country have corresponding business analytics programs. I would say some of them are closer to business school than we are. So some of these classes here are taken with some of the PhD students. For example, the optimization methods, machine learning methods, analytics edge are often common with doctoral education. Then, in other aspects of the program is that the students arrive and they are able to do research. These are some examples of some research project. This is a one-to-one relation with faculty members. It doesn't produce a thesis, but the students are involved, often produces scientific papers. And there is also an important component and a defining characteristic of the program is the so-called capstone project. The capstone project is a project that involves a company, 2 Master of Business Analytics students, a faculty member, and typically a PhD student. And this team starts in January after the match, addressing a problem, and then the MBAN students go to the summer in the company that they are assigned, and they start working there. In addition, the students get 20,000 tuition offset, which decreases a rather high tuition that we have. So in essence, even though the nominal tuition is 82,000, in reality, it's already 62,000. If they also have a research assistantship, this goes down to another 20. And there are fellowships involved. So in the end of the day, I would say, even though the cost is not negligible, it's not stratospheric either. We have, typically last year we had 30 students, we had 15 projects, this year 44, divided by 222. And we have some of the major companies in the country that are in analytics, and this is increasing with time. These are some of the companies that are involved in the capstone projects, and there is significantly higher demand. As I mentioned, today, this year, this is the class of 44. As with the ORC, the GPA is very high. So the average is 3.9, and my recollection is that the minimum is about 3.7 or so. The percentage female, international. I would say the profile of the Master of Business Analytics and the profile of the more research-oriented 2-year master students at the OR Center is similar in terms of the type of students we attract and their competencies levels. In terms of undergraduate degrees and undergraduate universities, you have a sense. We have a substantial, these are the countries represented, the United States, #1, about 40%, France, especially from the Grand Écoles, about 20%, and China, about 20%, and then many other countries as well. So, and if you look at the majors for undergraduate, they also are similar to the masters of the OR Center. They involve engineering departments, mathematics, operation research, as well as more science-oriented physics, as well as statistics. We also have a variety of career events. These are some of the people who presented. That it's held 1 or twice a month, a popular event among our students. We also have a career fair that the Master of Business Analytics is organizing. Last year, it attracted about 60 companies. This year, we expect of the order of 1,000 students, not only Master of Business Analytics, of course, but the entire MIT community. It's a big recruiting event in February. So these are some of the characteristics of the event. Overall, a success, and in fact, one issue we face is where to house it next time, because the demand has grown the space we have. The next one is February 5th, 2019. In terms of placement, you see some of the companies that we have, primarily consulting and tech, are the major startups also. These are some of the roles, fairly diverse. And in terms of career placement, everybody had 100% of the students. It's not a lot of students, 16 the first year, 30 the second year, have accepted an offer before graduation. This is the average starting salary. And the vast majority of the students work within the United States. We also, I won't cover it, but we also, the interest in analytics has increased the interest from our students from the Sloan School. And there are of the order of 350 students that we have created a certificate, which is not, of course, as advanced as the Master of Business Analytics. So the certificate, Professor Perakis is leading it from the faculty, and it has attracted of the order of 1/3 of the Sloan School. These are Sloan School students, Sloan Fellows, executive education. So it's a very significant interest, and our expectation is that this will increase further. As it has been observed in other institutions in the country, the interest in analytics is increasing. And while we have not seen it at the Sloan School, we have definitely seen nationally a decline of regular Master of Business Administration applications. So the MBAN, the N is non-negligible. Okay, so this is where we are in terms of the school. A very important new development also, which is an extremely recent one, 2-3 weeks ago, is that perhaps you don't know, but the MIT has announced a new College of Computing in I forget, what's the name? Not the Watchman College of Computing. That's a very major development. MIT has 5 schools, and my recollection is that the last school that has been added was the Sloan School in the early 50s. So this is sort of, although not exactly a school, but for practical purposes, a school. That's a major development for an institution that changes. Academic institutions do not change every year. And the OR Center has announced that it's participating very vividly in the new place. It's very much aligned with the strategy of the center of putting emphasis on data and decisions and analytics. We are participating in all aspects, from choosing the dean to educational programs and so forth. Of course, it's early stages. The college doesn't yet have leadership chosen, but we will. So that's an exciting new development, extremely aligned with the strategy of the center and what we plan to do. So I leave you with these thoughts, but also adding that in my view, I've been at the center since half its life, not all of its life like John, but at least half. So from 85, I could say this period, I mean, we haven't changed what we do extremely significantly, although we have. But I would say the world has been far more looking things at our direction. And I would say I consider the future of the UR Center very bright. And hopefully we will see some of the reasons of the optimism throughout these 2 days. I thank you, and I would like to introduce our Vivek Farayas, who is a friend and colleague, who is going to talk about the next topic of entrepreneurship and OR. Vivek?
So let me see if that's on. Yep. So the title is of this session is fairly self-explanatory. The goal is to kind of start off the day with a bit of an entrepreneurial perspective on analytics, which for some of us here at least is potentially and especially the students in the room is somewhat different perhaps from your day-to-day perspective on what we're doing. I have a pretty awesome panel lined up over here. We'll talk to each of our panelists, in a bit. But Janie's a venture capitalist. She's a partner at Fung Capital, which is the venture arm of Li & Fung, a company that I think many of us here are actually familiar with. Rama is a serial entrepreneur, most recently, at Salesforce through the acquisition of his company. And Philip is an entrepreneur as well, but got here in a very, very interesting way, and he works in biotech. And so, I think we'll get, an interesting set of perspectives, both in terms of this, as I said, entrepreneurial view of analytics, but also perhaps for the students in the room and the budding entrepreneurs, I guess, in the room, on the opportunities and pitfalls, right? So, without further ado, I think the way we'll run this is we'll have a fairly straightforward panel discussion, talking with each of our panelists, and towards the end, kind of open this up, to the audience for questions. So, again, without further ado, let's give all these guys a hand. First off, they've come here from quite a bit of distance for some of them. So just getting started, I'm going to get started with you, actually, Janie. So Janie, you're a partner at Fung Capital. Tell us a little bit about your journey, your path, to Fung. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are investing in.
Sure. I assume a lot of the folks here are familiar with the name Fung. Not many people are, but at least within MIT and Harvard, it's a pretty known name. The Fung family are incredibly active in the academic space. They're very media shy, but very active in academia. The phone business is organized in different groups. There's the traditional sourcing supply chain business, there's logistics business, and there's actually a phone retailing group, which is very much focused on running retail businesses from traditional offline businesses to online e-commerce businesses across the world. So Fung Capital is really the investment arm for the Fung family. So on the private side, not necessarily on the public side. Given the roots in retail, logistics, and supply chain, our focus is very much focused on enabling technologies that can really help retailers and brands and operators in supply chain logistics to better extract efficiency in that value chain of retail, right? Mm-hmm. And a big part of that, I think one of the reasons that I think you invited me to the panel is really, you know our business quite well. Data is at the very core of our investment thesis. So if you think about enabling the entire value chain of retail from sourcing, logistics to retail stores to the consumer and last mile logistics, traditionally we really see that more in a linear way, right? As a line. This is go from the factory to the consumer. And more so it becomes a circle. So it's a circular continuous action and continuous improvement. And at the very center of it is data.
And have you seen an evolution, shall we say, in the last 5 or 10 years with respect to the role data plays, shall we say, in some of your your investments? Is it moving from, so it's a bit of a leading question, but I guess, is it moving from something on the sidelines to being kind of central to kind of the value proposition?
This guy is setting it up for his own company,
Right.
which, full disclosure, I'm an investor in. Yes, so traditionally, we have done, our fund has been around for 30-some years. In fact, Rama's previous company was one of our targets, but ended up being stepped off the market by Demandware. It's in the data space as well. But a lot of our investments traditionally have been more in the workflow, right? Similar, if you think about operations and supply chain, a lot of the innovations traditionally have been about really trying to make the processes more efficient. A lot of that is more workflow, right? Because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that you can really work out. I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked already over the last, say, 2-3 decades, right? So more and more so, our investments have been more data-centric. I'll use Select as an example. These guys is really trying to use data of retailers and brands to try to understand solving a very fundamental problem in retail, which is how do you get your products right? How do you buy your products right? How do you allocate your products right? And what is the right frequency to fulfill the stores and the and now if I use Quotient, that was 3 years ago when we had our
4 years ago.
4 years ago we had our conversations. I love the idea, which is very much about using data so you can bring all the consumer-centric data together as an organization. And you can, downstream, you can have all these different touch points, right, to engage with consumers. With that better understanding of the consumer, you can really deliver better experience to the consumer. So be it on the product side or on the consumer side, I think data is really key in having that good understanding and be able to work with many workflow tools to deliver that good experience, that good execution.
Different processes to data-enabled smarter processes.
Absolutely. There are still interesting ideas in workflows, right? For example, in sales associating, right? Fairly new space in retail. Not new, but using technology to enable that process is fairly new. And that there are still a lot of interesting workflow opportunities. But I would say most of the deals I look at a lot of deals, I would say the vast majority is in the data space.
It's the perfect setup for Rama, actually, right? You're, until very recently, you were SVP of the Commerce Cloud product at Salesforce.
Correct.
And you got there through the acquisition of Quotient by Demandware, which in turn was acquired by Salesforce. Tell us a little bit about how you actually got there. You're an ORC alum. What was that? What was that path like? And what was your team at Salesforce working on? Until recently.
Yeah, sure. First of all, just thank you to all the organizers for organizing this. It's really great to be here. It's great to catch up with old friends. So my journey. So I came to the ORC for my master's many years ago. And then after my master's, I actually spent a couple of years working for American Airlines Decision Technologies, which many of you might remember, which was later spun out as Sabre. I worked in a number of different areas, most notably in the crew scheduling area. And then I came back to the ORC to do my PhD, worked with Professor Michel Gomans on combinatorial optimization. And then upon graduation in '94, I joined McKinsey & Company, where I was there for about 3 years, working on a number of problems across healthcare, high tech, and finance. And then after a short stint as a fund manager, I left to essentially take sort of the plunge and become an entrepreneur. As a quant fund manager, I was so sort of aghast at the poor quality of the tools that I had to work with. I decided that I had to leave and actually build those tools because nobody else seemed to be building them. So that was my first venture. After that, since then I've been involved in either founding or been on the executive team of 4 different startups in different industries: investment management, transportation, retail, and e-commerce. They all had the common thread that there was a business problem which I felt was sort of amenable to a data and algorithmic approach. And so we built a prototype, we demonstrated its value, we raised venture capital, and then built the company. And so the most recent one, Quotient, which I had spoken to Janie about 4 years ago, Quotient, essentially I started Quotient because I felt that while personalization technologies had been talked about quite a lot since the early 90s, often there was no person in personalization. If two different people go to an e-commerce site, they actually get very different experiences, even when the site actually knows a lot about them. And so I started Quotient in 2010 to essentially build a machine learning personalization platform, which would make it very easy for e-commerce companies to integrate this technology and then put it to use. To make a long story short, we raised venture capital from Bain Capital. We grew the company, and then in 2014 we exited to a company called Demandware, which is the largest e-commerce platform in the world. And then 2 years later, we sold Demandware to Salesforce for close to $3 billion. Which is now called Commerce Cloud. And so Quotient technology today actually is probably one of the largest deployments of personalization in the world. It runs on roughly 3,000 retail websites. It sees about 500 million shoppers every month. Actually, on Cyber Monday last year, I don't know about this year because Cyber Monday is still unfolding. Cyber Monday last year, we actually personalized over 1 billion experiences, all in real time. And I say that because while the core of what we did was data science, there had to be a lot of things around it to make it scalable, deployable, and so on and so forth. And I left Salesforce a few weeks ago because I was getting a little restless and I wanted to return to my entrepreneurial roots. I'm advising a bunch of startups now, and I'm also looking at a bunch of entrepreneurial ideas as well.
Thank you. And you're talking about personalization. It kind of leads to a nice segue to Philip, who's actually working in a completely distinct space, but again, data is at the core of it, and this notion of kind of personalization is still sort of very relevant over there. So, Philip is one of the founders of Seer Biosciences, a company in the Valley. He'll tell us a little bit about what Seer is actually working on. I don't want to steal his thunder. But Philip is also an MIT alum, and his path to Seer is actually pretty fascinating. So tell us a little bit about how you got here and what Seer is doing.
All right, thanks, Vivek. So I think the reason Vivek invited me here is because I think, as he mentioned, my path is not the typical one. I think I have a lot to learn on this panel from Janie and Rama, who have so many years of experience in entrepreneurship. I'm actually quite new to it. So my path actually started way back many moons ago at MIT. I was actually just a few blocks away over at Course 7. I did my PhD in biology. But it was actually in an area at the time, and actually still continues to be extremely data rich. It's structural biology. I worked on X-ray crystallography and worked on protein structures. But then I decided that spending so many nights in the lab, particularly in the cold room at 4 degrees, was not something that I wanted to kind of do the rest of my career. So I actually joined McKinsey. Actually, when I was just chatting, we joined around the same time. I think Rama, discovered his entrepreneurship a little earlier than I did. I ended up staying 20 years there, ending up as a senior partner and worked primarily in healthcare. But that was again a very data-rich environment, although the types of data that we were dealing with, were quite different. Then I got the opportunity actually to really get more into hardcore data science and joined Biogen. It was just down the block here, and actually helped to set up the digital health and data science group. And I think you actually have a panel on healthcare that I'm actually looking forward to. But many of the things that they'll be talking about in terms of diverse data sets, thinking about ways to transform healthcare, which is an extremely kind of inefficient kind of system, and there are plenty of good reasons actually for that. But the thought of data was trying to do things differently. But then after being exposed to so many interesting startup companies when I was at Biogen, I actually decided to do it myself, and actually teamed up with some great entrepreneurs. Actually, one of them, Bob Langer at MIT, has started many companies. The other, Omid Farakzad, who is at Harvard, is another kind of veteran. So the three of us started a new company, Seer. And what Seer is about is trying to take rich molecular information to transform healthcare, and specifically the information from proteins. Now, I'm not going to give a biology lecture, but the core paradigm in all of biology is DNA makes RNA makes proteins. Now, the first two, DNA and RNA, have already had a number of kind of breakthroughs. And you might have heard about some of the companies like Illumina and Affymetrix, and have revealed a ton of information that's actually, it continues actually, is to transform healthcare. But the one area that actually has not really had that same kind of technology breakthrough is proteins. And proteins are incredibly important. So, I mean, one way of thinking about this in an information perspective is DNA is effectively blueprints. So you can think about DNA as giving information on risk. Like you have a certain types of genetic profile, so you have X% of developing this disease. That's fantastic, but risk is not the same thing as actually detection and monitoring. And so that's where proteins come in. And so the only way that you can actually really track what's happening in the body is to find a way to study proteins. It's just been extremely difficult until now, and so at SEER we hope to change that.
That's fascinating. Where do you sort of view analytics in this in this platform that you guys are building? I think there's a sort of a more general thing, right? And I'm sort of interested in your more sort of general perspective as well, where right. So if you look at biotech, the way I think about it in sort of a very simplified sort of way, not being a biologist, right, is there's sort of a hardware component and a software component in some sense, right? The hardware component being something that kind of comes out of a lab, and the software component being something you might actually do with that information. I think for a long time, the hardware component's sort of the star of the show, and probably still the star of the show. With respect to this, what I'm calling software component, right? What you do with the data, what you do with the stuff that comes out of the lab. Broadly speaking, where do you sort of see analytics kind of playing sort of a differentiating role over there? And with SEER, with SEER specifically, does it play a differentiating role? What importance does it actually have?
Yeah, so that's a great way of kind of framing it in terms of hardware and software. We can also call it wet lab, where you're actually getting stuff splashed on you and chemicals and dry lab. But that it is a fantastic point, and in fact, we would not have been able to start SEER even 18 months ago. Analytics actually is core to what we do. There's two components of SEER. One is actually a unique platform, and that's actually the kind of the hardware of looking at proteins. It's just very, very difficult, and for those of you who want to be, bored or maybe educated a little bit, I'm happy to talk about it at a break, but looking at proteins has been very, very hard. So we develop a proprietary platform to do that. That's the hardware part of it. But all of that data needs to be analyzed. And it was actually overwhelming. You're talking about petabytes of data that we're going to be generating. And without some of the breakthroughs that have happened, both in terms of kind of the core platforms, AWS, the Microsoft Cloud, all of these kind of core platforms and on-demand algorithms, I think many of which you've been a part of doing in other industries, would not have been possible. So actually, we don't need to spend our time in building kind of the core infrastructure. It's already there for us to use. It's actually taking the insight from the biologists at the bench and applying it with really sophisticated software to actually get at insights.
Very interesting. And do you see this pattern actually playing out outside of outside of SEER as well? So I mean, given that you had Biogen earlier, long history at McKinsey, do you see this sort of pattern playing out more broadly within sort of biotech?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when you actually talk to investors, and we've been doing a lot of that lately, the one way to kind of get them interested is you throw around analytics and big data, because probably like any other industry, but it's actually something that if you look at, even some of the companies have been raising a lot of news, and the reason we're actually excited to be where we are in Silicon Valley. It really is the convergence of high tech and biotech. But you look at some of the companies that have the billion-dollar unicorns like Grail and Guardant Health. Actually, Guardant Health just went public, and so they're now a multi-billion-dollar public company. But all of them combine unique biological platforms with data analytics. And so it is a critical part of biotechnology now.
Guardant's a great example of this, right? I guess, in the sense that the hardware was completely, shall we say, off the shelf, in a sense. And it's all about, actually, do you mind telling the audience a little bit about
Yeah,
Garden?
so Guardant Healthcare, they, in some ways, they actually play in a similar field as Sierra, though we're approaching it from a completely different perspective. They play in an area called liquid biopsy, which is effectively looking at your blood and trying to understand disease patterns and make a diagnosis from that. It's called liquid biopsy because the main area that Guardant plays in is cancer. And if you or anyone that you might know is kind of unfortunate to get diagnosed, the way you actually diagnose cancer is actually you do a pretty invasive procedure. You go into your liver or your lungs or wherever it is and actually need to do a biopsy and study the tissue. Well, it turns out that the blood circulates all over your body, and so there are going to be trace amounts of biological material that pick up cancer cells and others. And so what Guardant has done is they've taken DNA and actually have developed a whole business model. We're going to do the same thing with proteins. We happen to believe that proteins is a better way to do it, but ultimately it may actually be a combination of these different sources of data. So that's what Guardant Health is about.
So again, I mean, to recap that was like sort of a completely generic sort of hardware piece on the Guardant side, right? Generating data in a way that's completely generic, and the differentiator has to be then sort of the analysis that actually goes from this raw data to actually extracting something that, in this case, is a more effective way of figuring out whether or not you're at risk for a cancer, or you have a cancer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Guardant has taken existing machines that do DNA sequencing and other types of molecular analysis and applied it in unique ways. And the reason I'm so excited about Sierra is we're actually going to try to do both. We're actually going to come up with a unique way of analyzing proteins and do the analytics on the back end.
And that says something about, I guess, the sort of skill set, I guess, right, that you've got to bring to the table if you're going to actually solve these problems, right? In the sense that you've got to sort of have an appreciation for both sides of it. And coming back to this hardware-software thing, you can't necessarily build a software while actually being completely blind to what the hardware is doing, and vice versa, right? It sounds like, really, especially at Sear, there's sort of this really nice kind of synergy, right, between sort of the design on both sides, which can hopefully, sort of take you forward. So it's really fascinating. Rama, tell us a little bit about, some of the sort of analytics successes you're sort of, you find kind of really, really interesting, right? So you've had this long experience, right? Share a couple of war stories with us. Tell us a little bit about stuff that you're really proud of.
Yeah, happy to. I think I could give you war stories back from American Airlines days, but let me choose a more recent example, if I may. So at Quotient, I talked about the fact that there was no person in personalization when we started the company. So one of the things we focused on was how do you personalize email campaigns? Email to this day continues not to die. It continues to actually grow in popularity, believe it or not. And so we felt that since email was a primary mechanism by which retailers spoke to their customers, could we make that communication medium much more personalized and efficient? And we realized that actually most emails, even though they were supposedly personalized, actually were performing very poorly. And on sort of digging through the data, we discovered that if you send out 100 emails, actually for 70 of those emails, you actually had no information about that person because they bought something 6 months ago. And so what we discovered was that retailers actually did not have a big data problem. They actually had a little data problem. Because for most of their customers, particularly if you are in fashion and apparel, you may shop once or twice a year. The merchandise keeps changing 3-4 times a year. So if you take traditional sort of collaborative filtering and say people who bought this also bought that, actually the intersection set is close to 0 for most of your customers. So what we decided to do was, well, if we can't match just on the sheer products that people are buying, perhaps we could match people on the attributes of the products that they are buying. So instead of saying that, Vivek and Philip, they both bought, product number 29, Philip also bought 33, so let's recommend 33 to Vivek. That doesn't work because most of the intersections is 0. We said, hey, they both bought different products, but the products had something in common. They were both Egyptian cotton, right? And we also found that Philip likes, an Oxford button-down, so maybe we can recommend that to Vivek. It's a sort of a simple, trivial example, but we found that by looking at product descriptions and product reviews and running natural language processing on it, we could extract some very interesting textual data and thereby sort of abstract the collaborating filtering up to a higher space where the degree of overlap and matching was much better. And so when we did that, we discovered that actually, instead of having data on only 30% of your customer base that was meaningful and reliable, it actually went up to 80% of your customer base. And that ended up us winning sort of the first several A/B tests we ran with our customer base. So I remember that very fondly. And then on a related note, we discovered that if we take the language that consumers were using on the websites and use that language in product descriptions on the website, on an email, it was much more effective. So for example, during Easter, we discovered that a lot of shoppers who had bought Easter dresses for their little girls, they would they would say things like, oh, my daughter looks like an angel when she wears this dress. And so our system picked up the fact that the word angel was being sort of disproportionately used. And so it'll automatically use the word in a subject line in an email saying, here is a little something to make your little one look like an angel. And those emails would have a dramatically higher open rate and better performance. So these are simple examples, but you can imagine if you systematically harnessed these examples, deployed them in production, all at scale with the minimum level of human intervention, you could have a lot of impact. And that's in fact what we saw in practice.
That's amazing. So actually, you said a couple of things that kind of pair up really nicely with stuff Janie thinks about, stuff Philip thinks about, right? In terms of data sparsity, right? So I really like this notion that you brought up that you sort of talk about things in a fast and loose way. You'd sort of be happy to say you're sort of living in a big data environment or a data-rich environment, whereas in reality, relative to the sorts of questions you're asking, the data is actually fairly sparse. Right, Philip, I imagine you see this quite a bit as well, right? Does this sort of thing ring bells for you, either from Biogen or
Oh, absolutely. You don't have the perfect data set in biology. Perhaps we never will, just because there's so many. But it is really trying to put the pieces together. I remember when I was at Biogen, we used to talk about big data. Data is big in volume, velocity, or variety, right? And unfortunately, we don't have the huge volumes of data. We have lots of variety of data. We have electronic health record data here. We have some DNA sequencing data here. Soon we're going to have protein data with SEER. But it's how you actually put the pieces together. And it actually does require just some, it's not so much the analytics, it's actually the clever insights that come in looking for the connections. And so I very much resonate with what you mentioned.
So it's sort of an interesting thing, and this brings me to Janie, right? So as we actually talk about sort of clever insights and the sort of thing of kind of spotting, something small that nonetheless actually makes a big difference, that's fantastic. And I think from an intellectual standpoint, everything our students work on, in some ways, the spark of the whole thing is one of these sort of simple, elegant ideas. On the other hand, right, you talked about this notion of scale. Right, so as you think about a clever insight, Janie, you're sort of thinking about these clever insights translated to billion-dollar companies, right? So how do you think about this tension, shall we say, between on the one hand, this search for this interminable, in some ways, search for value in data. Right, on the one hand, which could kind of have you spinning your wheels for a long time, to kind of on the other hand, building something that's repeatable, something that that can scale, something that has good unit economics, that sort of thing. How do you think about that tension when you evaluate companies?
It's certainly not easy, because oftentimes the entrepreneurs, I would say, are probably beyond the folks in this room, are probably the smartest, the most driven folks in the world, right? You really have to possess this tenacity to be able to break through walls to solve problems. So oftentimes when you're sitting in the same room talking to entrepreneurs about their ideas, their concept, what they're trying to build, the problem they're trying to solve, it all seems huge, right? So oftentimes, as venture capitalists, we're generalists and we're just sitting there in awe, and especially when you're talking to a professor there, right? I remember the first time I had the conversation with you, I felt like I was back in grad school again. But anyways,
I don't know if that's a good thing. I really don't know if that's a good thing.
but anyways, it's oftentimes out of the first meeting, you get so excited about one idea, right? And you feel giddy about it. But I I try not to give anybody an answer in that meeting or specifically about next steps, right? I want to kind of calm myself down, be it good or bad, to really think about the space, the market, right? So, how do you scale business? I think beyond the technology, the product, the problem itself, I think there are two other functions that are really important. One is the team, right? It's probably the most important thing when it comes to building anything scalable. It is the people behind that idea. The second thing is the market. The people part, and it takes a long time to evaluate. We knew each other. We had known each other for 3 years before we invested in the business, right? But the market part is something that's, you can actually do your homework and understand. Is this data analytics problem you solve currently, does that have a big market size, right? Or would that potentially have a huge growing market size? I'll give you one example. I like ideas that in the retail space that really focus on fundamentals, understanding the products, understanding the consumers. I think these inherently are big ideas. But in the logistics space, one example I recently came across is it's a really smart team that came out of very reputable university, and the team worked out logistics at Google, right? So it's a very smart team. The technology, the data analytics behind is very sophisticated. However, the problem that the market they're going after is trying to use data analytics to understand how to position your carrier ships if you own a fleet, right? And how many companies are out there owning actually a fleet of ships, right? Not half a dozen out there that are actually meaningful, right? And yes, it is a big problem for those guys, but I don't foresee any of them paying over $10 million a year for this, right? So ultimately, we have about, if we call that 10 companies in the world, about 100 million in revenue max, right? While the idea itself is very exciting, the technology behind it is very exciting, it simply is not big enough market for venture capital. And that's one thing, right? The other thing is, you have to also, even if some of the ideas can be very big today in terms of market size, but the market can change very quickly. Again, if I use the same example, you think about why do you need to optimize the positioning of your ships? It's because you have probably short supply of ships. You want to make sure that this is optimally positioned in Korea versus in Oakland, right? But when the market is in a position where there's actually oversupply of ships, you don't really care as much where the ship is. You want to put the ships in many places as possible, right? So if the market changes, the supply and demand changes in the marketplace, the market size changes as well. And we want to invest in a market where it's stable and it's growing, not when it's lumpy.
So you've brought up some fascinating points, right? Which I think, especially, not to paint us with too broad a brush, but it's not necessarily a perspective, right or wrong, right? That we necessarily would take in evaluating an idea from an intellectual perspective, right? Just to kind of just revisit some of the points you made, right? So you're saying, well, listen, on the one hand, it's table stakes that the idea is, a fantastic idea. That there's some special sauce. There's something really cool kind of going on under the covers, but that's almost just the start of it, right?
It's table stakes.
It's table stakes.
You must have a good idea. The product must work.
Correct.
Right. If the product doesn't even work, doesn't matter if you're solving a big problem or a small problem.
That's probably right for a conference, maybe at a different lolocation across the river, right? But. Can't help myself, right? But
I'm going over there after this.
and also Harvard undergrad, right?
It took me 25 minutes to get.
Actually, on this side, it's on this side of the river, though.
But no. So the tech has to work, but you have to have solved a meaningful problem. That's the starting point. But then what you're saying is, beyond that, you're actually thinking about a whole bunch of other things, right? So it sounds like one of the things you're thinking about is, hey, does this even make a difference, right? Great, you've done something, but does it move the needle in a way that you can kind of put like sort of a dollar figure almost on it? And then you're kind of not stopping there, right? You're sort of saying, well, great, you can put a dollar figure on there for maybe just picking up on your sort of shipping example. For some big shipping line, you can kind of put a dollar figure on there and say, great, this means X to you. Now you're sort of thinking, well, great, so that was that one company, that one customer. How does this scale more broadly to a market? So now all of a sudden the dollar figure is multiplied by sort of the size of the market, and you're using that to kind of evaluate, does this make sense or not? And then you're kind of adding a third lens to it. You're saying, well, great, that's the picture today. If you actually look at, sort of the macroeconomics around this, and I'm just using that word as a place filler, but basically, as I look at the broader environment around this, are there things that are actually going to completely change the marketplace? They're going to change my sort of hypotheses that then impact this sort of dollar figure. And I think ultimately putting all that together, you're saying, well, look, I started with what was potentially, putting aside the details, a really, really nice idea when viewed through a narrow technical lens, but then when expanded, to look at sort of impact, and you have a very specific way of impact, it didn't quite kind of necessarily play out for you. It didn't actually fit in with something that fit your theses, and as such, it was not investable. So I think that sort of tension between, on the one hand, kind of doing something technologically marvelous and technologically exciting, but on the other hand, almost an orthogonal axis, right, valuing it so that it actually makes a difference. I think that's a tough tension, and it looks like it's a tension that you have to actually kind of constantly sort of evaluate, and it's made even more challenging by the fact that you've got to sort of, as you were saying, kind of break through the sort of the noise or the shininess around whatever it is you're looking at.
As a venture capitalist sitting in Silicon Valley, right, you see a lot of shiny objects every day. And everything is packaged around data, right? So every single company these days I come across, well, not every single one, but 95% of them are not even big data or data analytics anymore. It's AI. Company, right? Everything is AI. How do you even cut through the noise, right? I think the only lens I can apply, especially in the early stage of artificial intelligence, is really the business impact, right? Everything I look at has to be, what is the connection to the dollar impact in your customer, right? Or if it's a consumer business, what is the actual tangible impact that you are making in that consumer's life? Yeah. Everything has to be specific, and there have to be metrics around that. Lots of shiny objects. I would say one thing, an example maybe folks here have come across as well is AR, VR, right? Augmented reality and virtual reality. Virtual reality today, I think the real application that actually can tie some to a dollar sign is probably gaming, right? And that's actually, it significantly enhance the gamer's experience. I'm not a gamer, so I don't really know, but at least what I can see is, from a revenue perspective, it is generating a lot of additional incremental revenue in gaming industry, right? But if I apply VR, AR to retail, and by the way, there are tons of ideas out there trying to bring VR, AR into retail. The idea sounds really good, where I'm sitting here, not here, but let's say if I'm after this panel, I'm going back to my hotel, but I could actually put on goggles and shop in Paris, right? The idea sounds very interesting, but the consumer adoption is simply not there, and there are too many hurdles to get there, right? So I also have to make sure. Now, do I believe that one day VR will come to commerce? Yes, I do. But when will that be? Is it 3 years? Probably not. Is it 5 years? Maybe. Probably, in terms of actually truly usable experience, is probably over 5 years out, right? So from my perspective, there are venture capitalists who play very early stage, right? But I choose to play, interesting kind of find interesting risk-reward ratio and the risk profile I'm taking, right? I want to make sure that I can see some path there. Right now, I don't see that path. I don't know the time frame, so I don't make that bet.
So I guess what you're saying is you're sort of exemplifying this notion of sort of, I don't remember where I heard this, but great ideas kind of not surviving first contact with a customer, right? And I think we've been taking this very positive view of things, and I want to keep things positive, but at the same time, we've got to be realists. So I guess I'd throw this at you first, right, Rama? What if what are, you talked about some of the things you're very excited about, and you had some great ideas that you just talked about. what are, on the flip side, what have been some of the things that have just kind of been frustrations, right? Like really kind of painful.
In terms of building analytic products?
Yeah.
I probably could go on for several hours on this topic.
That's probably the larger bucket, right?
But in the interest of time, maybe I'll just focus on a couple, which particularly pertains to how your end users, the end users of an analytic system, sort of interact with the system. So the first one is when you're trying to sell an analytic system, typically the customer will say, hey, we don't know if it's going to work, so we are actually going to do a test of some sort, where we're going to compare what you guys do with either sort of a competitor or maybe with the way we do business. And then if the results are meaningful, then we'll go forward, which all makes a ton of sense. The only problem is that sometimes the end users actually are going to feel threatened by the introduction of your system into their workflow, into their lives. And so either deliberately or unintentionally, things may get quote unquote screwed up. So I'll give you an example. We were working with a large retailer who wanted to use our price optimization system. They said, okay, we have 1,000 stores, we'll take 500 stores and we'll run your system on it. We'll take the other 500 stores and we will run it using our current system. And we'll see what happens after 3 months, which again, on the surface sounds like an eminently reasonable idea. We ran the test. In the beginning, our system was wildly outperforming the control. And then over time, they started converging. And we were really puzzled as to what's going on. Why is the sort of the delta not maintaining over time? Then we discovered that even though the stores had been split into 2 groups, the same merchants were responsible for all 1,000 for their merchandise. So the sweater merchant was responsible for all sweaters. So what would he or she do as a reasonable sort of profit maximizing individual? They will look at whichever group was performing well and then copy over the recommendations to the other group. So now when this sort of thing happens, initially you're just shocked. But what do you do as an entrepreneur? Do you actually go and accuse your customer of fraud? That's not a great way to win business. So again, that's an example of what happens during the sales cycle. You have to be very, very careful about these things. The second thing is, when they start using your system, they will actually use it in ways that you had never anticipated. So just to go back to the price optimization example, every time they logged in, it'll tell them, okay, here are your 1,000 products, and here are the actual price discounts you need to take for each of those products. And they had to take them, right? What our customers would do is they'll say, well, I don't quite believe the recommendation, but if it tells me to take a discount 2 weeks in a row, then I'll take it. So they came up with their own heuristic, which wrapped around our system. And thereby, all the results we had demonstrated during the pilot were no longer valid. And so it became a very difficult situation to deal with. And then finally, what will happen is that we had every one of my startups, we had what we would internally refer to as a defense attorney team, where the user would see something that quote unquote didn't make sense to them. They'll immediately send an email or call us and say, something is wrong with the system because this doesn't make any sense. Now, 10% of the time they were actually right? There was a bug in the product somewhere which we had to fix. But the majority of the time, they didn't understand their own business enough to know that what they were seeing was actually an artifact of life, their business, as opposed to a problem in the software. So these are all unique sort of problems that are endemic to analytically oriented products and platforms, which a lot of other sort of transactional, more workflow-oriented software just doesn't have.
I mean, there's sort of a deeper point as well, right, in what you're saying. And it kind of dovetails with what Janie was saying as well, which is how do you actually prove value, right? On the one hand, when we kind of cook up stuff as we think about, let's say, a research process, everything is very clean, right? And this applies as much to the kind of stuff Philip is doing, right? You're struggling with the sort of taking things from sort of the wet lab to sort of the real world. When you actually do something in the lab, whether it's a biological lab or something with pencil and paper, everything's really clean. You can actually control for really whatever you want to control for. And then as soon as that makes first contact with the world, all of a sudden there's all of this kind of confounding going on, which again, we can kind of just sort of put aside as being, that's just a detail. In reality, what you're saying is that's a huge, huge deal, right? In that, like, if dollars are how things are actually measured, then presumably those dollars are related to the value you're actually delivering. And if you can't prove that value, if there isn't a succinct way of actually demonstrating that value, that's almost a problem in and of itself. And I think you're sort of pointing out another point, which is, again, going from sort of something that's a generic workflow to, shall we say, truly sort of smart product or something doing something non-trivial. That's in and of itself kind of a curse, in that if it's not easily sort of understood, right, if that level of sophistication is so high that it can't actually be explained, all of a sudden, your customer is not quite necessarily happy with it.
That's something we see a lot, actually, is investors focus on retail tech, right? A lot of times the technology itself, product itself, is so sophisticated, but your users are, merchandisers, marketers, right? They're very smart people, but they're also very busy. They're running a million different things a day, right? They simply don't have time to think about what is driving that insight that your machine is recommending me. I don't understand this. This doesn't fit into my typical day of work, right? So they call out on you, actually, that something is wrong with the product. I find that's really hard as a startup trying to solve that problem, to understand, making sure you have got a really sophisticated product that's also able to actually, get into the everyday workflow as well. I think that's an inherent struggle for data analytics focused products. Mm-hmm. You really try to stay at the brain level, being the intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. But the brain has to be connected with all the limbs and everything else you do, right? So you can actually execute on the task. So either, I think a lot of there are two routes two approaches I typically see that entrepreneurs and companies are trying to make that happen. One is you build all the limbs yourself. So you start with the brain, right? The intelligence, then you ended up actually building all the different execution, the downstream application as well. That's easy to control, but it takes much harder, and you lose a lot of focus.
A lot more capital, too.
Exactly, a lot more capital intensive as well. And then the other approach is to actually partner with the limbs, all the different applications, right? And that's hard as well, right? But it probably sometimes, if you're able to find the right partner, I think in which case, Quotient ended up being in the realm of Salesforce, right? In the Commerce Cloud, is you are able to actually control the execution of it. That makes it much harder. So hopefully in the last 2 years, you don't have to take customer calls and say, hey, what's wrong with your product, right?
Yes.
So I think it's...
And also when a Salesforce product does something, unintuitive, they think that they are at fault, while a small startup does something, it's the startup's fault.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. So, how do you find the right approach to make sure that your data analytics product actually really gets into the everyday workflow of the users?
So it sounds like you're kind of adding on yet more desiderata here, right? Like in the sense that, one, it has to be repeatable. It has to be something that's easy to kind of grok, easy to understand. And to sort of the points we're making here, simplicity is almost like it's not necessarily something we actually think about as a constraint, right? When we actually build solutions, algorithmic solutions to sort of data-driven problems, we're not necessarily thinking about simplicity or sort of explanatory power as a thing. But that's from a very pragmatic perspective, that's really important. Just sort of, and that's not just in retail, right? The cover article actually in Nature Bio, just I think last month, Philip, right, had this sort of thing of really, a new way of, shall we thinking about sort of, neural networks that is actually explainable, that a bunch of folks at, UW, I guess, implemented in the ICU. They saw sort of, it was really important, right? It was really important to sort of say, okay, now there's a story to this. And the fact that, I think a publication like Nature Bio would actually, this is software, very clearly, it's not on the hardware side, right? And it's not just any old software, it's actually kind of capturing the points you guys are making. It's sort of saying, not just good enough to have a neural network or whatever it was in that case, right? That actually gives me this really sophisticated score of what's actually going to happen to this this newborn, I think, right? I think it was for infants or something like that. I also need to kind of understand why, and in some ways, that was actually the content. Philip, how important do you? I mean, this is again a leading question, but how do you how do you see this actually? How have you seen this sort of thing play out at, let's say, Biogen or even at McKinsey?
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, I'm just in rapture just listening to you. I'm learning so much. So. But I mean, the takeaway that I took, which resonated from some of the experience of Biogen, is data analytics at the end of the day has the biggest impact when you change behavior. Now, in the cases that you talked about, the changing kind of consumer behavior and merchandisers and things like that. In healthcare, the behavior that you're trying to change is actually quite complex. I mean, let's take the simplest example, which is changing the behavior of the physician, because the physician is kind of key there. One thing that we found is even though there's a perfect alignment with what we were trying to do with some of the things of data analytics and physician, which is at the end of the day, bring information so that you can treat your patients better. The value proposition had to be so absolutely clear because physicians are, merchandisers are the same way, but physicians are even more so, just extremely busy people. And that's one kind of barrier. The other is that they've trained for years to get to be so many busy people. And so they're actually quite confident in what they're trying to do. So to actually change behavior is really, really hard. We actually tried to, actually it's still going on at Biogen, it's one of the big projects that we did, which was, if you look at one area of neurological disease, multiple sclerosis, which is a very debilitating disease. It often starts, unfortunately, when you're in your 30s and 40s, and actually you just, the end is clear, which is you're going to end up in a wheelchair, on a ventilator. Actually, it's very debilitating. And we actually have very little data about the disease course. The only data that you get is when the patient actually comes in to see the doctor maybe once or twice a year. And there's this whole richness of information that you're being lost. So we set up a project to study patients with 10 clinical centers, actually getting them to come in, again, twice a year, but actually doing a lot of battery of tests, sending them home with actually apps so they could track their symptoms at home. It was a huge kind of data project, and the whole intent was to actually bring the 2% of the time that the patient's in the office to actually cover much more of that and learn much more. So fantastic idea, but you would not believe actually the challenges in making it work. And I won't go into them now, but happy to talk about them. But it's exactly to the point, which is, even though there was perfect alignment and this is the right thing to do, incredibly hard, and you had to boil it down to very, very concrete kind of steps as to how are you going to protect the patient's private information. Oh, I only have 10 minutes to do this. How are you going to actually make me, make this happen? So it resonates very much with what both of you had mentioned.
So it's really interesting, right? I think we've kind of walked this really kind of nice path from the sheer power of analytics and the differentiation it actually brings to the table, right across a whole bunch of different domains, to then kind of putting on kind of maybe a little bit more realism to it, and sort of saying, well, all that's great, but then you got to worry about all these other things, right? You've got to worry about, hey, what's the ROI? What's the return on me actually making this step? Can I even measure that ROI? Can I make this part of somebody's day-to-day process? That's far from sort of obvious, right? It's really fascinating, and in many ways kind of captures I think what we wanted to do today, which is bring the sort of entrepreneur lens, shall we say, to the work that all of us are here are trying to do. Let me sort of kind of try and conclude this on the following point, right? So a lot of us here in the audience, especially the students in the audience, and the very young faculty that are just graduated from here, they're just starting out their careers. They're sort of, in my mind at least, I think in all of our minds, right, a representative of in many ways kind of the brightest minds in in whatever you want to call it, data science, machine learning, analytics, pick your flavor, right? As they go on to actually, and a number of them are very entrepreneurial. So as they go on to kind of, founding their own companies, right? Building their own sort of entrepreneurial ideas from the ground up, what advice would you actually give them, right? You guys have kind of trod the path, so to speak, right? And you've got the advantage of hindsight. For these folks that are kind of sitting here at like kind of this golden point in time, right? Looking forward, what sort of advice would you give the room? And any of you, right? Like I'll throw this open to all of you.
I mean, I'll start because I probably have the least to say, being the least experienced. But I think the one thing, in addition to all of the great things about deeply understanding the market and the difference, is I'd encourage actually the people in this audience to actually cast your your net really wide. You have a fantastic set of tools that and capabilities that you're developing. You just never know where you're going to end up. I'll give as an example. Andrew Lee, who has worked with Vivek and actually was a student in this program, is now at Carnegie Mellon, right? We ended up collaborating at SEER, and this is someone who doesn't have a biology kind of background, did fantastic work, was actually ended up being the lead author on a paper that we're submitting to Nature Bio. And it's just because he could think broadly and actually apply his kind of tool sets. So I'd actually encourage you to do that. You have a fantastic set of tools that could be used across many areas, and you just may never know where they end up. And I would just put in a shameless plug for SEER, which is we're looking for a few really talented data people, and if you're interested, come talk to me.
I think just a couple of points. The first one is when you're figuring out what idea to build a company around, to build a startup around, it's useful to remember that it's much better to create painkillers than vitamins. And the reason for it is very interesting. So when you actually go and try to sell your product to someone, they roughly have 3 questions in their minds. One is, why should I buy any product from this category? Number 2, why should I buy your product? And number 3, which is by far the most important question, why now? Why can't I just wait and just continue doing what I've been doing all along for a little bit more? And to answer that why now question, it's sort of like if somebody is in pain, when you give them a painkiller, they are not going to ask why now. But when you give them a vitamin, they're like, yeah, maybe I can postpone this. So think about that very, very carefully. Is what you're building, is it a vitamin or a painkiller? Because oftentimes you can tweak the product to make it go from being a vitamin to being a painkiller. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is don't be too wedded to any particular set of techniques or algorithms and so on, right? Doesn't matter if it's called data science, machine learning, whatever. It doesn't matter. Your customer doesn't care. Ultimately, your product has to really work and deliver results, and that's the only thing that matters. So don't be too sort of wedded to any one thing. Be very flexible. And on a related note, while we all love our algorithms, oftentimes the true value in a startup comes from having some sort of advantaged access to a data set. And so you should really develop your data antennae, if you will, and be on the lookout for interesting data that's becoming newly available. Because there are lots of smart people in the world. They'll probably figure out the algorithms as well as you can. Sorry to disappoint you, but that's the truth. But what nobody can replicate very easily is having access to a particular data set, which is sort of privileged. So just keep that in mind. And then, when your product takes off and you want to scale your business from 2-3 customers to 30-40 customers, practice sort of customer anthropology. What I mean is, if you ask customers what they want in your product, they'll tell you certain things, but it's sort of an incomplete picture of what's going on. It's much better to convince them to let you sit in their offices and watch them work and watch them, use your product. You will come up with insights that they would never have bothered to tell you about. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, speed is much more important than any other factor as an entrepreneur. It's much more important than IQ. And the reason is that, I've sold my startups to companies like, Salesforce and Oracle and so on. It's amazing. Once you get acquired, the speed of everything just drops, right? It's sort of like you're like a spaceship suddenly dropping at a warp speed just because you got acquired. And that was a revelation to me because it shows that if you're a startup, your real sort of advantage is just speed. Because the big companies with lots of resources just won't operate fast enough. They have to go through approvals and this and that and whatnot. So do whatever you do, right? Do it really, really fast, right? Increase your clock speed and how you run your business, and that's going to be a much bigger predictor of success than just about anything else I can think about.
Jenny, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's not too much I will add, but I will say this is more on the emotional side of being an entrepreneur. Now, I work with entrepreneurs, I invest in entrepreneurs, I married an entrepreneur as well, right? So being the spouse of entrepreneur gives me a very different perspective as well. You've got to ask yourself the question. One is, I think, to these guys' point made earlier, I think it's I want to emphasize that. Is this problem worth solving? Is it even worth for you to put in years of time. Every startup at UBeauty, you probably spend several years working on that, right? Is it worth for you to spend anywhere between 3 to 7 to 10 years solving that problem? So is that problem worth solving? It could be a big problem that's worth solving. It could be, something that's really personal to you that's worth solving, right? So think about that. 2 is, do you feel the technology infrastructure is ready for you to solve that problem, right? I think before AWS, a lot of problems, and you might have the determination to solve that problem, but you simply don't have the infrastructure. And when you have to build the infrastructure to solve a problem, it takes too long, it takes too much capital, right? The third point is really the emotional side is, do you feel you're ready to solve the problem, but there's a lot of unforeseen stuff that's going to happen along the way, right? Do you have the withdrawal? Do you have the tenacity to keep at it? Because being an entrepreneur, the moment for celebration is probably the 0.1% of your overall entrepreneurial life of that startup, right? Oftentimes you're focusing on solving problems. You might have a huge customer waiting 9 o'clock in the morning, by 5 o'clock you're thinking about, how do I deliver it to this customer? Or you might have another customer that called you and saying, what's wrong with your product, right? So you ended up focusing, a lot of your day, your time is focused on solving problems. And a lot of times it's very frustrating and negative, right? And if you are the founder, the CEO of that company, it's a very lonely job. There are not many things you can share with your employees, right? And a lot of you have to shoulder that.
Or even with your spouse.
And you talk to your spouse, right? So make sure you have the right partner. or you have your supportive partner and you're able to really deal with the stress personally yourself. And that's something I think a lot of entrepreneurs often ignore at the early part of their entrepreneurial journey, to think about, is this something that you actually want to do? Now, after you think through all that, you're ready to do it, then don't overanalyze, just do it. Speed is of the essence. The more time you spend about thinking and analyzing, you lose the time to market.
Satisfies, right?
Just on that, I want to say, Mark Andreessen has a fantastic quote, which I believe in, which is, when you're an entrepreneur, you exist in only 2 mental states, terror and euphoria.
It's true.
And I can vouch for that, personally.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, this has been a really awesome panel. I think for a lot of us here, there's just lots of pearls of wisdom, really something great to take away. Let's wrap this up with thanking the speakers.